Hey guys, tonight we're plunging tooth first into one of history's most horrifying yet absurdly well-mannered nightmares. Victorian dentistry. Welcome to a world where dental pain wasn't just accepted, it was practically a hobby. Anesthesia was a bold suggestion at best, and your dentist was also the local expert in boot repair, sheep shearing, and possibly minor exorcisms. Imagine walking into an office that smells like pipe smoke, shoe polish, and a hint of panic, only to discover your dentist doubles as the town's barber, part-time butcher, and full-time collector of mysterious stains on his apron. The tools? Let's just say they look like they were borrowed from a medieval torture museum, and then used to fix a wagon wheel. So before you settle in, take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft white noise. Get comfortable and prepare your jaw to clench sympathetically for the next hour. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered how people brushed their teeth before toothpaste existed? Or what happened if you needed a root canal in 1840? Did they even have drills? Were dentures made from actual human teeth? Spoiler, yes. Could you survive a cleaning when the only available tool was a pair of pliers last used on a horse? Would you trust someone in a blood-stained apron named Mr. Grindle, gentleman surgeon and partial blacksmith to pull your molar? Congratulations! You've just woken up in 1852 London. The air smells faintly of soot, boiled cabbage, and despair. You've got a toothache that feels like it's personally trying to escape your skull, and the nearest dentist is also the town's barber. Welcome to Victorian dentistry, where smiles were rare, screams were common, and the only thing more rotten than your teeth was the medical advice. You wake up in your modest Victorian room with sunlight filtering through smog-stained curtains and immediately wish you hadn't. The throbbing in your jaw makes you question your entire existence. It's not just a toothache. It's an existential crisis with enamel. There's no ibuprofen, no ice pack, and the only pain relief in sight is gin. So you drink. At 7 a.m., welcome to Victorian healthcare. Let's set the scene a little deeper. Your pillow is stuffed with straw that crunches every time you move, and the stale air in your rented room smells faintly of old books and new mildew. As your brain surfaces from a night of restless, jaw-clenched dreams, the pain in your mouth feels like it's being orchestrated by a tiny Victorian composer with a thing for symphonic agony. Each heartbeat sends a fresh jolt through your cheek, up your ear, and out through your patience. You try not to open your mouth for fear that half your teeth might fall out in protest. You're not alone in your suffering. In the 1850s, everyone you know has some dental horror story. Friends missing molars, neighbors nursing abscesses. Even the local vicar wears an alarming set of Waterloo teeth that clack menacingly every time he attempts a sermon about the afterlife. It's not just the working class either. Rich or poor, the Victorians are united by their bad teeth, their deep mistrust of dentists, and the steady consumption of things like syrupy tea, sticky sweets, and food that seems scientifically engineered to lodge itself between your gums and your will to live. As you shuffle to your cracked mirror and squint at your swollen cheek, you consider your options. There aren't many. You might try rinsing your mouth with cold water, except the tap is a pitcher, and the water is already gritty. Or maybe you'll chew on a clove, if you can find one in your spice jar, or wedge a piece of linen soaked in whiskey between your gum and lip. It's the Victorian version of have you tried turning it off and on again? Except the only thing that shuts down is your ability to form coherent thoughts. Outside, you hear the city waking up. Hoofbeats echo on cobblestones. Newspaper boys shout the latest headlines. Queen endures extraction. And somewhere in the distance, a factory bell clangs. You'd like to ignore all this and roll over, but your toothache is the sort that makes sleep a distant memory and breakfast an Olympic sport. Toast is out of the question. So is anything hotter than lukewarm porridge, which you eat on one side of your mouth, chewing like you're auditioning for a role as a particularly resentful squirrel? This is the moment when you start bargaining with fate. If this tooth stops hurting, I swear I'll give up sugar, go to church, and never complain about Aunt Maud's cooking again. But fate, like Victorian dentistry, is not in the habit of making deals. The pain pulses on, refusing to be bribed, soothed, or ignored. You contemplate your next move. Do you go to the barber, surgeon, knowing full well his tools are older than your landlord and twice as rusty? Do you ask your landlady for her secret remedy, which probably involves mustard plasters and strong language? Or do you simply hope the tooth falls out on its own, as teeth so often do in this era, usually at dinner parties, or when you're trying to impress someone with your one remaining canine? Every hour, the toothache becomes your world. By midday, you're snapping at co-workers, flinching at loud noises, and keeping your mouth in a tight, dignified line. People stop asking what's wrong. They already know. Bad tooth, they mutter, with the grim sympathy of those who have been there and survived, more or less. By mid-afternoon, you're fantasizing about yanking the tooth out yourself, using the only tools at your disposal: a sewing needle, a leather strap, and an utter lack of common sense. Evening arrives. The pain has become a companion, steady, insistent, like the ticking of the mantle clock or the slow, relentless advance of cholera. You pour another measure of gin, raise your glass to progress, and wonder if tomorrow you'll finally be brave or desperate enough to let someone take a pair of pliers to your jaw. For now, all you can do is try to sleep, jaw throbbing, spirit battered, and mouth resolutely closed. Congratulations. You survived another day with Victorian teeth. And in the morning, if you're lucky, the only thing you'll have lost is another molar. Nung and renegotiating your spiritual contract with any higher power that might care about molars, you surrender to the obvious. You need help. Not the call your dentist kind of help. Victorian Britain hasn't invented that yet. Instead, you're heading out into the foggy morning to search for someone who claims to fix teeth and isn't, technically, a veterinarian. This is trickier than it sounds. The year is 1952, and dentist is a job title with about as much legal protection as vibes manager. The main street is bustling, the air thick with coal smoke and horse manure. You pass shops selling bonnets, corsets, sausages of highly suspicious origin, and finally, a cluster of signs all crammed onto one swinging shingle: Mr. Grindle, barber, tooth drawer, corn remover, bootmaker. Because why specialize? In the Victorian world, multitasking is both a business plan and a threat. You push open the door, a bell tinkles overhead. The smell inside is hard to describe, like a blend of stale pipe smoke, vinegar, something metallic, and a hint of wet dog. Every surface is a little sticky. The waiting area is 3 chairs and an old newspaper, its edges frilled from use and, you suspect, panic gripping. 2 customers are already ahead of you. A grizzled man nursing a foot in a bucket, and a pale woman clutching a bloodied handkerchief to her jaw, each regarding the doorway with the haunted eyes of people who have read the reviews but have no other options. Behind a counter stands Mr. Grindle himself, a man built like a barrel, with enormous mutton chops and hands the size of small hams. He is simultaneously trimming a customer's sideburns, soaking a pair of leather boots, and sharpening something with far too much enthusiasm. You immediately realize you are at the very bottom of a long and unsanitary food chain. He greets you with a cheerful, "Lost a tooth or just your courage, love," and Not knowing which is worse, you simply nod. In the Victorian age, professional boundaries are more of a suggestion. Anyone could claim to be a tooth drawer, barbers, blacksmiths, grocers. There are even stories of street performers pulling teeth between sets, probably for the audience participation points. The concept of dental school is a joke. The only exam Mr. Grindle has passed involved lifting a cow by the horns. There are no diplomas on the wall, just a disturbing collection of pliers, hammers, and mysterious hooks arranged like a medieval armory. Each tool is multi-purpose. Toenail remover, hoof cleaner, tooth extractor, personality adjuster. Cleanliness? Well, he wipes them down with the same rag he uses for everything else. That's what counts for sterile. You sit. The chair is wooden and sticky, angled oddly, perhaps to discourage escape. On the wall is a faded poster advertising painless extractions and gentle boot repair, no questions asked. You can hear, somewhere, the ominous swish of a leather strop, like a snake warning you off. Mr. Grindle approaches, examining your mouth by shoving a thumb roughly the size of a turnip between your lips. "You've got a right mess in there," he announces, far too loudly for comfort. You try not to think about what his last customer's problem was, or whether they still have all their original body parts. There's no X-ray, no gentle bedside manner, no attempt at small talk beyond. This'll only take a moment, which in Victorian English translates directly to, "You might want to bite down on this." The tools clatter ominously on a tray beside you, some clearly repurposed from other lines of work. It occurs to you that, in a few decades, the dentist will be a respected medical professional, trusted with drills, anesthetics, and sterile latex gloves. For now, you're putting your fate in the hands of a man who can fix your overbite and your walking shoes in one appointment. 2 for 1, really. You close your eyes, say a quick prayer, and open wide. Somewhere down the hall, a boot gets banged into shape. A barber's pole creaks, and a woman in the waiting room faints with dignity. This is Victorian dentistry, a confusing hybrid of commerce and carnage, where a winning smile means you survived with most of your face. Welcome to the only place in town where you can get your tooth pulled, your beard trimmed, and your boots resoled by the same person. Ideally, not with the same set of tools. You're sitting in Mr. Grindle's chair, wooden, sticky, slanted for both drainage and escape deterrence, when your eyes wander to a battered handbill tacked up beside the door. Painless tooth removal by the newest scientific method. It boasts, in cheerful lettering that might as well be painted with blood. There's an illustration of a woman reclining gracefully, while a smiling man yanks a molar. She looks relaxed, even serene. You, meanwhile, are sweating through your shirt and gripping the chair like it's about to be thrown overboard. Let's be clear. Painless dentistry, in the Victorian era, is mostly advertising. The painless part is over as soon as you enter the building. There's no Novocaine, no numbing gel, no gentle playlist of whale sounds. Instead, there's a rag to bite, a bottle of gin for courage, and a faint hope that you'll pass out before it gets interesting. The dentist points at the poster with a flourish. See? It's all the rage these days. Science, comfort, and a swift hand. You're starting to realize the definition of swift is relative. So is comfort. The real show begins when Mr. Grindle selects his weapon, a heavy pair of forceps with the patina of 100 years of human suffering. He gives them a quick wipe on his apron, which is now more red than white, and gestures for you to open wide. The sound of metal on enamel makes your jaw lock on instinct, but you steel yourself. He mutters about the latest advances, which, as far as you can tell, means he now aims for the correct tooth at least 60% of the time. Progress. The audience, because there's always an audience, leans in. The man with the foot in the bucket is now on his second round of smelling salts. And even the dog outside pauses mid-scratch to witness the spectacle. Victorian extractions aren't private affairs. They're group entertainment. A little blood sport before lunch. You suddenly understand why the phrase "grin and bear it" came into vogue. The procedure begins. The forceps clamp down on your tooth, and Mr. Grindle gives it a wiggle, then a wrench, then a yank. So forceful, you see flashes of your ancestors. The pain is immediate, bright, and personal. A white-hot line that travels up your face and out through your tear ducts. You make a noise somewhere between a yelp and an aria. In the background, the poster woman continues to smile serenely, because she is not real, and also probably fictional even by Victorian standards. The sound is the worst part. The crackle and crunch, the scraping of metal against bone, the pop as something finally gives way. These are the things you will remember in the quiet hours of the night, long after your mouth has healed, but your trust in mankind has not. To distract yourself, you count ceiling stains and wonder which ones are blood and which are just ordinary Victorian mildew. Suddenly, it's over. The forceps rise, triumphant, clutching a molar that looks about 3 centuries older than you feel. Mr. Grindle waves it in the air for everyone to admire, as if he's just landed a particularly stubborn trout. You're handed a rag to bite, your head swimming with equal parts shock and adrenaline. "There you are, love. Easy as pie," he announces, as if you haven't just involuntarily confessed your sins to God and every ancestor you can name. You stagger to your feet, spitting blood and pride into the nearest spittoon. The waiting woman nods at you with new respect. The man with the bucket gives you a slow, knowing clap. Outside, the world carries on. The horses keep plodding. The smog keeps rolling. And somewhere, someone is reading that same handbill, convinced that their own painless experience will be different. It won't be. But, as you limp away, jaw throbbing and one tooth lighter, you realize you've survived a rite of passage as old as the empire itself. Victorian dental care. Painless, according to the poster. Unforgettable, according to everyone else. It's the day after your extraction, and you're starting to reconsider everything you thought you knew about pain. Your mouth is a disaster zone, raw, swollen, and leaking just enough blood to make you feel vaguely Victorian. The memory of the forceps lingers, as does the sympathetic round of applause from the other patients. But as you nurse your wound with a compress that might once have been clean, you hear the town's latest gossip. Did you know you can get your tooth pulled while you're asleep now? With magic gas? Welcome to the dazzling new world of anesthesia. Victorian anesthesia is a lot like Victorian plumbing, innovative in theory, unreliable in practice, and sometimes fatal. Around mid-century, doctors and showmen alike begin touting chloroform and ether as the answer to everyone's prayers and lawsuits. If you're wealthy, or at least ambitious, you can request it for your next extraction. Of course, request is a strong word. You mostly hope the dentist has heard of it, and that he's not just experimenting on the side. For the working poor, anesthesia is more urban legend than everyday miracle, a luxury for people who also eat fresh fruit and own more than one pair of socks. So you set off, curious and desperate. The next dental appointment comes with a new kind of anxiety. Will you feel everything, or will you feel nothing? And possibly never wake up again. You're greeted at the door by the same bell, the same stained wallpaper, and a new, slightly nervous sign. Ether and chloroform, now available. for the discerning gentleman or adventurous lady. There's even a small price list. Extraction, 1 shilling. Extraction with gas, 3 shillings. Results not guaranteed, no refunds. Inside, the dentist is fussing with a glass bottle and a rag, both of which look like they've been recently borrowed from a chemistry demonstration gone wrong. Here's the future, he assures you, pouring a generous amount of liquid onto the rag. The smell alone is enough to make your toes curl, sharp, sweet, and deeply suspicious. He waves the rag in front of your face, instructing you to breathe deep, but not too deep. And let me know if your heart starts racing or if you feel an uncontrollable urge to dance. Soothing. If you're lucky, the next thing you remember is waking up missing a tooth, but blissfully, also missing the memory of the event. If you're less lucky, you drift in and out, catching snatches of conversation. Careful, that's not the right one. The sound of crunching bone and the distant whistle of a train that might just be your soul departing your body. For some, the gas doesn't work at all, and you're left groggy, nauseated, and still painfully aware of everything. Others wake up halfway through, much to everyone's surprise, especially the dentist, who drops his forceps and makes a mental note to never use just a splash more ever again. Meanwhile, those who do survive tell stories, tales of floating above their bodies, of seeing angels, or, more commonly, rats, and of feeling like they've just returned from the Crimean War. Victorian newspapers love these stories. Woman survives painless surgery, declares herself queen, and every week another dentist tries to drum up business by promising the ultimate in comfort and safety. But anesthesia is a gamble. Sometimes, the patient never wakes up. Sometimes, they wake up too soon, or with a permanent twitch. There are reports of patients who, convinced they had died, refused to pay their bills. You can't charge a ghost, sir. For the dentist, it's equal parts opportunity and occupational hazard. By the end of the century, anesthesia is here to stay, but still treated with respect and a little terror. The average Victorian would rather brave a second-rate extraction than risk a third-rate anesthetic. You finish your story by sipping gin, not for the pain, but to steady your nerves. After all, tomorrow you might be the next one to breathe deep and hope for the best. In the world of Victorian dentistry, comfort is always optional. Safety is a luxury, and the only guarantee is a story worth telling, assuming you live to tell it. Let's take a moment to appreciate the Victorian dental toolkit. If appreciate is the word for gaze in horror, and immediately develop a sudden respect for modern plastic. After your run-in with Mr. Grindle and his questionable grasp of hygiene, you've begun to wonder just what exactly these people are putting into your mouth. Spoiler: it's not good. If you have a fear of dentists, the 1850s are here to validate every single one of your anxieties. Displayed proudly on a splintery wooden tray are the greatest hits of the 19th century dental world. There are forceps of every size and shape, each with a unique design philosophy. Removes molars, and possibly your hope. The most infamous tool of all is the tooth key, which looks like the result of an unholy union between a corkscrew and a crowbar. Its purpose? To clamp onto your offending tooth, twist, and, ideally, remove just the tooth. In reality, the tooth key sometimes removes everything from healthy enamel to small pieces of jawbone, and, in one memorable case, a patient's faith in humanity. You watch, wide-eyed, as Mr. Grindle lays out his arsenal. Some of these implements are so rusty they could double as tetanus delivery devices. A few appear to be repurposed from other trades entirely. One looks suspiciously like a hoof pick, Another might have once been a butter knife. He assures you they are all sterilized, which, in Victorian terms, means he's given them a brisk wipe on his apron and possibly dunked them in gin after taking a sip himself. Victorian dental tools are not delicate. There's no whisper of latex gloves or gentle suction tubes humming away. Instead, you get raw iron, splintered wood, and maybe a rag to bite down on if things get a bit spicy. The forceps are designed for brute force. If a tooth refuses to budge, Mr. Grindle simply upgrades to a larger size or employs a wedge and mallet, transforming your dental visit into something that would make a medieval torturer proud. The real fun comes with the elevators, tools meant to lever your tooth out of its socket. This process involves equal parts science and enthusiasm, with a splash of improvisational theatre. If at first the elevator doesn't work, try again, or switch to the trusty old tooth key. No part of your mouth feels safe. Even your tongue is reconsidering its loyalty. There's no subtlety, no finesse, just noise and pressure, and the occasional oops, won't miss that bit. The sound of scraping metal against bone is unforgettable. A combination of chalk on slate, the squeak of rusty hinges, and a dash of oh no, that's attached. For the truly unfortunate, the tools sometimes slip, turning a routine extraction into a surprise mouth remodeling. You learn to close your eyes and think of England, which doesn't help, but at least gives you something to do besides panic. Blood, predictably, is everywhere. The tray, the rag, sometimes the floor, sometimes the ceiling, depending on how enthusiastic Mr. Grindle is feeling. Victorian dentistry is a messy business, and cleanup mostly involves hoping the next patient doesn't notice. There's no mouthwash to rinse. Instead, you're handed a cup of lukewarm water and told to spit like a gentleman. When it's over, you stagger out, dazed and slightly lighter, sometimes in the teeth, sometimes in the soul. The tools are wiped off and replaced, ready for the next victim, patient. You can't help but marvel at the resilience of people who survived an era when a trip to the dentist meant risking more than your smile. So the next time you see your hygienist's sterile plastic tools, remember, the Victorians faced their dental nightmares with nothing but iron, rags, and unearned optimism. And, of course, a prayer that their next extraction would be done with a tool made for humans, and not, say, cows. So you've survived Mr. Grindle's office and lived to tell the tale, jaw swollen and dignity slightly dented. But maybe you're feeling brave, or desperate, enough to try your luck elsewhere. In Victorian Britain, that usually means a visit to the local barber surgeon, a title that combines two of history's most nerve-wracking professions into one multitasking marvel. Because why should a man with a razor stop at haircuts when he can also pull teeth, lance boils, and set broken bones, all before lunch? Step inside the barber surgeon's shop, and it's a feast for the senses, in the same way a livestock auction is a feast. The air is thick with the scent of bay rum, pipe smoke, and something faintly reminiscent of spoiled pickles. Rows of jars and bottles crowd every shelf, filled with mysterious powders, questionable tonics, and what you pray are leeches but might be someone's lunch. A battered chair sits in the middle of the room, surrounded by a sea of towels stained in every shade of red, burgundy for blood, rusty for old blood, and a shade you try not to think about for reasons best left to history. The barber himself is a man of indeterminate age, sporting an immaculate moustache and a steady hand. He can trim your sideburns, open a vein, and extract a molar all in the same breath. His tools are arranged on a tray. Straight razors, scissors, tweezers, lancets, and of course a collection of forceps that look suspiciously similar to Mr. Grindle's, only shinier and with a little more swagger. Let's be honest, Hygiene is an afterthought. The same blade that shaves your neck might have been used on the farmer's corns that morning, or the butcher's thumb, or the mayor's unlucky wisdom tooth. The towels get a perfunctory rinse in tepid water between customers, which, in Victorian logic, counts as sterilization. The barber surgeon's hands are steady, but you suspect they haven't seen a bar of soap since the Napoleonic Wars. There's a rhythm to the place. A sort of grim efficiency. Customers come in for a haircut, and the conversation always turns to health. Still got that toothache, Henry? Aye, but not as bad as my bunion. The barber nods sagely, then whips out his forceps and gets to work, not even pausing to put down his scissors. There's no anesthesia unless you count the shot of gin discreetly offered before he starts. And no small talk except for an encouraging, hold still, this'll be over before you know it. That last part is a lie. It's a bit like a Victorian version of a modern nail salon. But instead of gossip and nail files, it's medical emergencies and bloodletting. Sometimes the barber surgeon offers a 2-for-1, a shave and an extraction. You leave smoother in the face, lighter in the jaw, and slightly less sure about the future of your immune system. The real magic is in the barber surgeon's adaptability. He is, above all, a problem solver. Broken finger? He'll splint it. Sore throat? A little bloodletting to balance your humors. Tooth won't budge? He's got a mallet. He's part stylist, part doctor, part medieval improvisational comedian. You can almost admire the confidence, until he's elbow deep in your mouth, humming a sea shanty, and making casual observations about the weather. Once it's all over, you stagger out, face smarting from a close shave and mouth sore from amateur dentistry. Outside, life continues. The barbershop pole turns, the leeches wiggle in their jar, and another customer takes your place, ready to risk it all for a cleaner chin and, with luck, one less throbbing tooth. And that, dear listener, is how the barber surgeon became a legend, not just for haircuts, but for the dubious honor of having the highest customer screams per hour in all of Victorian England. You may have lost a tooth, but you've gained a story. And possibly tetanus. Let's take a breath, if you dare, and marvel at the most miraculous, terrifying, and unpredictable development in Victorian dentistry. The arrival of early anesthetics. For centuries, your best hope for a pain-free tooth extraction was to drink until you could no longer feel your face. Then hope your dentist had steady hands and a forgiving disposition. But now, the world is changing. Enter chloroform and ether, the magical potions of the age, or, depending on whom you ask, the stuff of urban legends and medical malpractice lawsuits. It starts with a rumor. Maybe you overheard it in the public house, wedged between stories about haunted turnips and the neighbor's suspiciously robust chickens. Did you hear? Someone whispers, "Old Missus Billings had her tooth pulled without feeling a thing." The dentist waved a handkerchief under her nose, and poof, she woke up, toothless, but smiling. Of course, she also tried to marry the umbrella stand for a week afterward. But those are just details. The promise of painless dentistry spreads through Victorian London like wildfire, or possibly like cholera, depending on your optimism. People line up outside the fancier dental parlors, clutching coins and hope, desperate to believe that the dark era of bite the belt and scream is finally over. Early advertisements trumpet gentle extractions under the influence of science. Always science, with a capital S. Never mind that no one really knows how much ether is too much. or how often a patient might simply drift away and never return. Let's set the scene. You're in the waiting room, surrounded by wide-eyed optimists and seasoned skeptics. The dentist's assistant brings in a gleaming bottle of clear liquid and a mysterious sponge. You watch as the sponge soaks up the potion, its fumes heavy and sweet, laced with the unmistakable undertone of danger. "Just breathe," says the dentist, holding the sponge an inch from your face. You do as you're told, because the alternative is Mr. Grindle's rusty forceps and a poster promising painless extractions. The effects are immediate and dramatic. First, there's a strange floating sensation, as if you're rising above the chair, the ceiling, even your own body. You hear voices from far away, echoing and nonsensical. Turnip pudding, no. More ether. Then nothing. Blessed, merciful, nothing. If you're lucky, you wake up to a mouthful of blood and the warm, fuzzy realization that it's all over. If you're unlucky, you wake up to half a tooth and a dentist in full panic mode, trying to explain why your left eyebrow is missing. Not everyone is a fan. Some Victorian doctors warn that ether is the devil's work, a shortcut to the afterlife. Clergy frown at anything that removes suffering too easily, as if pain is a divine Wi-Fi signal. And for every success story, there's a cautionary tale. The man who snored so loudly under anesthesia that the dentist gave up, the lady who sang the national anthem through her entire operation, the child who woke up halfway through and bit the dentist. Justice, if you ask the other patients. There's also the small matter of explosions. Ether, you see, is highly flammable. Victorian dental surgeries are not exactly models of fire safety. What with their gas lamps, open flames, and hair full of pomade. It's not unheard of for an entire extraction to end in a small blaze, after which everyone agrees to go back to gin and stoicism. Despite all the risks, anesthetics represent progress. They transform the dental experience from one of certain horror to one of uncertain possibility. Maybe you'll wake up smiling. Maybe you'll wake up confused. But, for the first time in human history, you have a fighting chance of not remembering a single terrifying detail. So next time you recline in a dentist's chair and listen to the gentle hum of the anesthesia machine, remember, it all began with a Victorian dream and a very, very brave sponge. For every Victorian willing to risk the barber surgeon's shaky hands or the local tooth drawer's rusty pliers, there are a dozen more who'd rather take matters into their own trembling fingers. After all, why pay a week's wages for a dental experience that might end with tetanus, humiliation, or the town crier reporting on your demise, when you can handle your oral disaster at home? Thus was born one of the most questionable trends of the era, the do-it-yourself dentist kit. You could purchase a kit at your local chemist, and it came in a charmingly macabre wooden box, complete with brass clasps and an air of Victorian optimism. Open it up and you'd find a pair of tiny forceps, a miniature bottle of tooth tincture, several lengths of cord, a folded pamphlet of instructions written in font so curly you'd think it was meant as a vision test, and a small, mysterious saw. Sometimes, if you paid extra, the kit included a tiny mirror. Not to see the problem, of course, just to watch your own face as you realized the magnitude of your poor decisions. Let's examine the tooth tincture. Promoted as an instant solution to agony and decay, this wonder liquid's ingredients list was shrouded in mystery. Most versions included clove oil, a dash of opium if you were lucky or unlucky, and whatever the pharmacist had lying around that hadn't turned completely black. The instructions suggested applying it directly to the offending tooth with a tuft of cotton. The real effect? A burning sensation so intense you'd briefly forget all otherworldly pain, including your toothache. But tincture was only the opening act. If the pain persisted, it was time for the forceps. These tools had the ergonomic design of a lobster trap and the gripping power of an undercooked noodle, but they did the job, eventually. Many a brave soul attempted the single-handed, no-mirror extraction. Some even recruited a friend, or, more dangerously, a spouse to do the honors. Domestic relationships were tested, and in some cases ended right there in the parlor, as one partner learned the limits of love while the other discovered the limits of the human jaw. For the children, things got even more experimental. Parents, desperate to avoid another trip to the local butcher dentist, would tie a length of cord around a wobbly tooth and the other end to the nearest door handle. 1, 2, 3, slam, to went the door. The tooth usually came out, along with several ounces of trust, and the hope of ever eating apples again. It was the Victorian answer to gentle parenting: teach resilience with a little home-based trauma. Of course, not every kit user was successful. Some gave up halfway through and simply decided to live with the pain, adopting a permanent scowl and a diet of tepid gruel. Others, emboldened by half a bottle of gin and a bad idea, ended up in the barber surgeon's chair anyway, sheepishly presenting their handiwork. A mangled gum, a tooth still attached by a thread, and the distinct scent of burnt clove oil trailing behind them. But even with its risks, the DIY dentist kit was a source of pride. It represented Victorian grit, self-reliance, and a spectacular ability to ignore medical advice. You could say, I did this myself, even if this was a lifelong fear of spoons and a pronounced whistle when you pronounced your S's. For a brief, shining moment, you were your own dentist, pharmacist, and cautionary tale. So tonight, as you uncap your minty toothpaste and regard your electric toothbrush, spare a thought for your ancestors, the ones hunched over a smoky lamp, gripping a pair of cheap forceps in one hand and their last nerve in the other. In the age before modern dentistry, sometimes the bravest thing you could do was read the instructions, ignore half of them, and just yank. If you thought the world of Victorian dentistry couldn't possibly get any stranger, brace yourself, because nothing is quite as unsettling or as revealing as the booming business of false teeth. In an age where sugar addiction was on the rise, tooth decay was rampant, and real dentistry was often out of reach, a beautiful smile became a rare and expensive luxury. But don't worry. If you lost your teeth, you could always buy someone else's. Or, if you had a few to spare, you could sell your own. Welcome to the 19th century economy where incisors and canines were literally currency. The desire for a presentable set of chompers cut across all social classes, from wealthy merchants to factory workers and even the upper crust. False teeth were big business. And not just any false teeth. The best were made from actual human teeth, preferably young and healthy, plucked from wherever they could be found. Where did they get them, you ask, hoping the answer is donated by generous volunteers. It was not. The most prized teeth often came from the recently departed. Grave robbing became an unofficial profession, and after any major battle, scavengers combed the fields, extracting teeth from fallen soldiers before the bodies had even cooled. Dentists paid by the bag. The most famous example? The Waterloo teeth. After the Battle of Waterloo, looters harvested thousands of teeth from the dead and sold them to dental suppliers, who fashioned them into shiny new dentures for the fashion-conscious elite. Next time you see a sepia-toned portrait of a Victorian grandee flashing a pearly smile, remember, those teeth might once have belonged to a French cavalryman named Pierre. But graveyards and battlefields weren't the only supply chains. Desperate people sometimes sold their own teeth, especially the poor, who saw it as a grim but practical way to pay the rent. Tooth fairs, yes, that was a thing, were held in big cities, with buyers examining the goods like apples at a market. It wasn't uncommon for advertisements to read, "Wanted, sound teeth, good prices paid." Young persons preferred. Just imagine the Craigslist post. Once the raw materials were procured, the artistry began. Victorian dentures were feats of engineering, often built onto carved ivory, porcelain, or, if you were really unlucky, bits of animal bone. They were heavy, awkward, and prone to clacking during conversation, turning every dinner party into a percussive performance. But at least you looked healthy, so long as you didn't smile too wide or try to eat anything firmer than stewed cabbage. Maintaining your new teeth was another ordeal. There were no Polident tablets or ultrasonic cleaners. The advice was simple. Remove your dentures at night, scrub them with salt and a stiff brush, and hope for the best. Lost a tooth? No problem. Just pop by your dentist, who would pry out the old one and jam in a new Waterloo special, sometimes while you were still in the chair for a haircut. And then there was the social etiquette. Wearing false teeth was fashionable, but it came with challenges. Victorians were masters of subtlety. One did not discuss dentures in polite company, even as one's upper plate threatened to leap from one's mouth during a hearty laugh. Entire etiquette manuals were written on smiling discreetly, which in practice meant never showing more than 3 teeth at a time and never, ever sneezing in public. Still, there was a certain pride in owning a set of fine dentures, regardless of where the originals came from. It was the Victorian way. Ingenuity, pragmatism, and just a hint of graveyard chic. So if you ever feel embarrassed by your orthodontist's bill or grumble about your retainer, remember, the Victorians built a whole economy on second-hand smiles, and every grin told a story, even if it wasn't originally your own. You'd think the phrase second-hand smile would belong in a modern thrift store, but in the Victorian era, it was alarmingly literal and surprisingly profitable. The 19th century obsession with having a respectable gap-free grin created a market for human teeth, and nowhere was that market more lucrative or more unsettling than in the aftermath of battle. Enter the infamous Waterloo teeth, a dental phenomenon born out of the mud, blood, and misery of Napoleonic War. Picture it. The field of Waterloo, June 1815. Cannons have fallen silent, and the landscape is an apocalyptic tangle of uniforms, shattered swords, and tens of thousands of bodies. But as dusk falls, another army emerges, not of soldiers but of scavengers. While the living count their losses, the tooth hunters get to work. They move swiftly and efficiently, pulling fresh, young teeth from the mouths of the fallen. No time for sentimentality. These are premium goods, destined for the drawing rooms and parlours of fashionable Europe. Victorian dentists, never ones to ask too many questions, snapped up these grisly harvests by the bagful. Demand was insatiable. After all, the best dentures required real teeth, preferably from healthy young men. Waterloo had supplied an endless crop, and the Waterloo teeth became the gold standard. For the right price, anyone could wear the heroic incisors of a British grenadier or a dashing French cuirassier, though probably best not to mention this fact at afternoon tea. The Waterloo teeth were cleaned, sorted, and often bleached before being wired into ivory, bone, or sometimes even gold frames. The end result was a gleaming, if slightly uncanny, set of dentures. They clacked in time with every word and sometimes slipped alarmingly during moments of excitement. But they were status symbols, proof of both wealth and a certain patriotic vigor. What could be more fashionable than literally grinning with the valor of the nation? It wasn't just Waterloo. After every major European conflict, from Crimea to smaller colonial skirmishes, armies of looters rushed the fields, yanking teeth from the dead as a side hustle. In the wake of any battle, tooth traders followed the soldiers, carrying sacks and forceps, paid in coin and grim jokes. The dental profession, meanwhile, politely looked the other way and pocketed their fees. But behind the gleaming smile, there was an unmistakable ghostliness to the practice. Imagine, if you will, sitting for a portrait, dressed in your best finery, grinning wide for the new photographic technology, and flashing the teeth of a man who died, charging a cannon. There was a superstition that haunted many a new denture wearer. What if the spirit of the original owner came with the teeth? Did the ghost of a French soldier make you crave garlic? Was your sudden urge to march in formation a dental side effect? There are no statistics, but there are plenty of whispered stories. For those who couldn't afford the best Waterloo teeth, there were cheaper alternatives. Teeth from the poor, from criminals, or, in desperate cases, artificial ones made from porcelain or animal bone. These substitutes were often uncomfortable and prone to shattering at awkward moments, such as mid-proposal or while biting into a celebratory turnip. Nothing said romance in the Victorian era, quite like spitting out half your smile during dessert. As the century wore on, the supply of battlefield teeth dwindled, and science eventually caught up. Porcelain and vulcanite replaced human teeth in dentures. The black market dried up, and so did the ghost stories. Mostly. But the legend of Waterloo teeth lingered. A strange reminder that even in an age of progress, people would go to heroic, if grisly, lengths for the perfect smile. So the next time you're at the dentist, dreading the bill for a crown or a filling, be glad you don't have to choose between modern resin and the last molar of a fallen soldier. The Victorians did, and they wore their history with every bite. If you've ever felt lazy for skipping a night of brushing, allow yourself a moment of smug satisfaction. You're already leagues ahead of most Victorians. The standards of dental hygiene in the 19th century were a terrifying blend of optimism, superstition, and questionable home science. For every well-meaning bather with a brush and a dream, there were 10 more improvising with kitchen leftovers, herbal lore, or products that should have come with a skull and crossbones on the label. Victorian cleaning practices didn't just fail to save your teeth. They sometimes seemed purpose-built to finish the job decay had started. Let's start with basics. The toothbrush. Yes, it existed, but it was nothing like the ergonomic, neon-handled marvels sitting in your bathroom cup. A Victorian toothbrush was typically fashioned from bone or wood, with bristles made of boar hair, badger fur, or whatever stiff, bristly substance the local animals could spare. It was the kind of thing you could use to clean your shoes or sweep the hearth if your mouth survived the first go-round. They weren't replaced very often, either. One toothbrush might last a family for years, or even be shared among siblings. That's right. Family brushing time. A fun, little round of guess who ate the onions. Toothpaste, as a concept, was even more dubious. The average Victorian dentifrice could include just about anything you could grind up or scrape together. Recipes ran the gamut: powdered charcoal, burnt bread, chalk, cuttlefish bone, salt, and, because why not, brick dust. The wealthy sometimes imported fancy tooth powders made from oyster shells, talc, and the essence of soap. The less fortunate did their best with a handful of soot or a dab of mustard. Instructions suggested that a good cleaning was meant to leave your mouth tingling and your gums pleasingly pink, which was code for actively bleeding. If the sensation faded before lunchtime, clearly you hadn't scrubbed hard enough. Mouthwash was no safer. There were dozens of miracle elixirs on the market, each one promising to banish bad breath and toughen your gums. Many of these concoctions were alcohol-based, naturally, but others boasted more adventurous ingredients: ammonia, vinegar, alum, and in one infamous brand, a hint of mercury. The more it stung, the more it worked. If you weren't gasping and tearing up, the Victorians would have said you just weren't trying. And if your teeth turned a suspicious shade of grey, just smile less. For the true devotee, cleaning sometimes involved tools that should never have been anywhere near a human mouth. Scraping tartar was done with penknives, sewing needles, or metal picks, sometimes borrowed from the cobbler's kit. There were even advertisements for dental scrapers you could buy by mail, promising to banish stains and root out rot. Instructions for home use amounted to: apply firmly, stop if the pain is overwhelming, which of course nobody did. But the best, meaning worst, of Victorian cleaning innovation was the fashionable lead-based tooth whitener. Nothing said upper class like a dazzling white smile, so ladies and dandies would brush with lead paste, ignore the metallic taste, and wait for that signature glow. What they got instead was gum disease, loose teeth, and a side of chronic poisoning. The motto was beauty at any cost, and in the 1800s, the cost was often most of your enamel and a fair portion of your life expectancy. So next time you fret about forgetting to floss, take comfort. You're not reaching for the brick dust or sharing a boar bristle brush with 6 siblings. Modern dental care may be a chore, but it doesn't come with the risk of instant lead poisoning or the subtle terror of a family toothbrush. In the age of Victorian hygiene, cleaning your teeth could kill you, and sometimes it nearly did. If you think you've ever suffered from bad breath, spare a sympathetic sniff for the average Victorian. In an age where toothpaste was optional, toothbrushes were communal, and diets revolved around boiled cabbage and questionable meat pies, halitosis wasn't just common. It was a way of life. Victorian breath could clear a room, wilt a rose, and serve as an early warning system for oncoming visitors. If the 19th century had had breath mints, they would have been currency. Let's take a morning stroll through the typical Victorian home. The first scent that greets you isn't the sharp tang of lemon cleaner or the gentle whiff of morning coffee. No, it's a cloud of humanity. A cocktail of unwashed wool, coal smoke, and the unmistakable tang of morning breath, heavy with last night's onions and ale. In close quarters, this bouquet was inescapable. Family, friends, and livestock all shared air, and by noon, even the wallpaper needed a lie-down. Breakfast wasn't helping matters. Forget the breath-freshening effects of citrus and mint. Instead, you'd likely have a hunk of black bread, some pickled herring, or a bowl of pottage that had been simmering for a week. Maybe you'd enjoy a slice of cheese so ripe it might qualify for citizenship. The morning's only beverage? Sweetened tea, already taking its toll on your enamel, and possibly a dash of gin for medicinal purposes. Every bite was an assault on your molars and your social life. Tooth-cleaning rituals, as you've learned, were more art than science. If you had a brush at all, you shared it. If you made a paste, it probably contained something abrasive or mildly poisonous. Some folks chewed on twigs, rinsed with vinegar, or dabbed their gums with salt in a noble effort to mask the horror. Others went full apothecary and carried little pomanders, fragrant balls of herbs and spices, hoping a waft of clove or lavender would distract from what was happening inside their mouths. News flash. It rarely worked. Then there was the great Victorian diet. Rich or poor, meals leaned heavily on onions, garlic, and salted meats. These flavors weren't just for dinner, they lingered, setting up permanent residence in the back of the throat. Spices like cinnamon and mint were expensive, so most breath remedies were out of financial reach. The upper class occasionally indulged in candied violets or imported licorice, But even they had to face the brutal reality of graveyard teeth and festering gums. The poor did their best with the occasional sprig of parsley and a polite turn away from company during conversation. Social norms adapted accordingly. Victorians were famously reserved, but the tradition of stiff, formal distance wasn't just about manners, it was practical. You simply didn't get close enough to anyone to risk catching a full blast of their oral bouquet. Letters and poetry extolled rosy lips, but nobody ever mentioned the scent. Even romantic moments were carefully staged. A stolen kiss behind the hedgerow, more like a mutual agreement to hold your breath and pray for rain. There were, of course, remedies for the truly desperate. Apothecaries hawked mouthwashes made from alcohol, spices, and, occasionally, ammonia. Breath perfumes promised a floral mist, though the effect rarely lasted past the next sentence. Some products boasted imported peppermint oil, but unless you had royal connections or a very forgiving wallet, you were more likely to mask bad breath with even worse aftertastes. And so the Victorian world rolled along in a haze of politeness and pints, everyone quietly enduring each other's breath while pretending not to notice. If you've ever worried about garlic on a first date or carried a tin of mints to a meeting, congratulate yourself. You're living in a golden age of oral hygiene. The Victorians had to make do with distance, dignity, and dreams of peppermint. So next time you wake up with dragon breath, remember, in the 1800s, that was just called morning. And somehow, despite it all, people still fell in love, wrote poetry, and shared a laugh. Even if they did it from the other side of the room. Picture Victorian England, a land of soot, fog, and, increasingly, the irresistible lure of sugar. In the early 1800s, sugar was a luxury, a white, crystalline status symbol locked away with the family silver, guarded like a tiny, edible dragon's hoard. But as the century rolled along and the Industrial Revolution cranked its gears, sugar suddenly exploded onto every market stall and pantry shelf. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was about to wage silent war on the teeth of a nation. At first, sugar seemed like a miracle. Working families added it to their tea and porridge, and for the first time, children everywhere grew up knowing what a sweet tooth actually was. Shop windows filled with candies, sticky buns, biscuits, and toffee so hard it could shatter dreams. The British Empire was at its height, and so was the national glucose level. The country that once lived on gruel and boiled root vegetables was now inventing ways to cram sugar into everything, from puddings to breakfast cereal to health tonics, of deeply questionable medical value. But there was a catch. Dental care had not kept up with the times. The average Victorian mouth, already besieged by poor hygiene and questionable cleaning practices, was now ground zero for a sugar-fueled apocalypse. Sugar didn't just rot teeth. It did it with the subtlety of a cat burglar and the enthusiasm of a marching band. Every spoonful was a love letter to the bacteria in your mouth, who multiplied overnight through wild parties on your enamel and left behind acid-shaped souvenirs. Suddenly, toothaches became an epidemic. Children wept over molars that ached and throbbed. Adults grimaced through afternoon tea, clutching their cheeks and dreaming of a day when biscuits would dissolve harmlessly into the ether. Barber surgeons and tooth pullers rejoiced. Their business was booming. Posters in shop windows advertised painless extractions and new scientific methods for rotten teeth. Never mind that the methods involved either whiskey or prayer, sometimes both. For the wealthy, sugar consumption was a status symbol and a dental disaster. Dinner parties featured elaborate sugar sculptures, molded into swans or miniature temples, which guests admired before slowly gnawing apart. The Queen herself was known to indulge in the occasional sweet. The result? The richer you were, the more likely you were to sport the infamous black-tooth smile. You might have pearls in your tiara, but your teeth looked like they'd been soaking in chimney sweepings. The working class wasn't spared either. With sugar cheap and plentiful, sweets became the highlight of childhood. Street vendors sold candied nuts and sticks of rock to eager crowds. Birthday cakes, once rare, became the new normal. Much to the delight of everyone except their molars, dental pain was universal, and solutions ranged from clove oil to quietly suffering through another day with your jaw clamped shut. Of course, Victorians invented their own folk wisdom about sugar. Mothers warned children that eating sweets before bed would invite the toothworm, a mythical creature blamed for every cavity. It was part dental advice, part horror story, and part desperate attempt to keep the cost of fillings down. Still, the temptation was too great. By the late 1800s, entire cookbooks were dedicated to sweet treats, and dental apocalypses were written into every family's future. The greatest irony: sugar had come to symbolize comfort, progress, and modernity. It was the sweet reward after a long shift in the factory, the centerpiece of Sunday tea, the reason children looked forward to holidays. All the while, it was quietly eroding the nation's smiles, one toffee at a time. So, next time you open a bag of candy, spare a thought for the Victorians, conquered not by war or famine but by dessert. Sugar, the silent assassin, proved you could have too much of a good thing, and for an entire era, that good thing ended with a toothache. By the mid-1800s, the rules of Victorian society governed everything from skirt length to salad fork usage. But nowhere was fashion more ironic or more painful than in the pursuit of perfect smile. In an era obsessed with appearances, your teeth were suddenly the most visible badge of health, virtue, and social standing. Nothing said refined like a row of dazzling, even, or at least present, teeth. Naturally, no one had them. The cult of the smile was everywhere. Society columnists praised actresses for their pearl-white grins. Etiquette guides insisted that ladies show modest teeth, neither too broad nor too thin. If you were lucky enough to have your own teeth, intact and mostly white, you were considered almost suspiciously virtuous. Rumors swirled about people whose smiles were unnaturally radiant, the Victorian version of accusing someone of using Photoshop. The problem, of course, was reality. Very few people had what anyone today would call a photogenic smile. Centuries of bad diets, neglected cleaning, and sugar's silent assassination meant mouths were often a patchwork of blackened stumps, brown stains, and ominous gaps. Smiling too wide at a dinner party was like showing off your medical records. Risky, a bit taboo, and guaranteed to elicit whispered commentary. Desperation, however, is the mother of invention. The wealthy went to incredible lengths for the right look. There were tooth powders imported from Paris, promising a gleam to rival the moon, and lead-based polishes that delivered a blinding white for all of a month, before your gums rebelled and your teeth threatened to mutiny. Some socialites even dusted their teeth with starch or flour before a soiree, the way you might powder your nose before a selfie. The result was less dazzling radiance and more ghost at the bakery. But trends rarely make sense in the moment. Fake teeth, preferably Waterloo teeth, were a fashion accessory. Wearing a full set was a sign you had both money and the right connections. There were even catalogues, complete with sketches and swatches, advertising different shades and styles. You could choose the classic English, the continental arc, or the very daring royal display. For the right price, your dentist might even gold-plate a tooth, so you could flash some bling every time you uttered good evening. It was a strange time to be alive, and a dangerous time to eat apples. The poor, meanwhile, adapted in their own way. Smiling became an art of subtlety. Keep your lips together, master the mysterious half-smirk, and laugh quietly into your handkerchief. It was the dawn of the British stiff upper lip, where reserve was less about emotion and more about concealing a molar gap the size of Cornwall. Children were warned not to smile at strangers, partly for safety, partly for public health. Even etiquette books weighed in, warning women not to bare the teeth wantonly, lest they appear coarse or worse, forward. The only thing more scandalous than a wide smile was a loud one, so society events were filled with gentle titters and the kind of polite grins that wouldn't scare a parlor cat. Modest display of the teeth, the experts advised, is a virtue, and in an age when even a modest smile was a dental miracle, modesty was the only safe option. The obsession with teeth even leaked into the world of art and photography. Portrait painters strategically softened mouths, while early photographers begged their subjects to hold steady and keep your lips demure. If you spot a Victorian portrait with a toothy smile, it's either a rare moment of candor or someone showing off new dental work for posterity. So, next time you snap a selfie with a mouthful of straight, bright teeth, remember the Victorians. Their smiles were fought for, faked, and fiercely policed. The fashion of a smile was serious business, equal parts social ladder, status symbol, and high-stakes dental gamble. In the end, the best accessory wasn't jewelry or a silk cravat. It was the courage to show your teeth, no matter what was left of them. For much of the Victorian age, dental care was a sort of Wild West. Barber surgeons with rusty forceps, bootmakers moonlighting as tooth pullers, and more than one amateur enthusiast who believed a steady hand and a strong stomach were the only credentials needed. But the world was changing. Progress was coming for the mouth, one extraction at a time. By the middle of the 19th century, a strange and wondrous figure emerged on the high street: the professional dentist. At first, nobody quite trusted them. Who would? They wore immaculate suits, spoke in reassuring tones, and hung polished brass plaques outside their offices. This was suspicious. The British public, used to agony and chaos, viewed the new dental specialist with the same skepticism reserved for door-to-door miracle elixir salesmen or anyone with consultant in their job title. Still, toothache is a great motivator. One by one, the desperate and the hopeful lined up at these new dental parlors, clutching aching jaws and modest dreams of survival. Inside, the world looked shockingly modern. There were waiting rooms with potted ferns and actual reading material. Instruments gleamed under gaslight, clean, arranged, and not a hoof-pick among them. The air was scented not with panic and blood, but with lavender and coal tar soap. The dentist, meanwhile, was everything a Victorian professional aspired to be: calm, confident, and, miracle of miracles, washed. But the true revolution was education. For the first time, universities and dental colleges began popping up, promising a curriculum longer than find the tooth, pull the tooth. By the 1850s and 60s, aspiring dentists could attend lectures on anatomy, chemistry, and something delightfully called oral surgery, which until now had meant whatever you could survive. Textbooks circulated, full of diagrams, advice, and stern warnings against using blacksmith tools on molars. Membership in dental societies became fashionable. Nothing said respectable like a certificate with Latin on the wall. With education came innovation. Dentists imported tools from Paris, Vienna, and Philadelphia. The dental drill, once a nightmare device powered by hand crank or blind faith, got a foot pedal and, eventually, steam power. Fillings evolved from whatever metal is handy to slightly more scientific blends. Gold was prized for the wealthy, tin for the merely desperate. There were even early experiments with painless extractions, using ether or chloroform. Though, for many, the memory of waking up halfway through a procedure remained a cautionary tale. Of course, progress had its limits. Not all dentists were created equal. For every educated pioneer, there were two more with questionable diplomas and a deep fondness for shortcuts. Some embraced hygiene and antiseptics. Others believed a splash of gin and a quick prayer was as modern as anyone needed. Dental regulation was, in true Victorian style, a patchwork of well-meaning rules and spectacular loopholes. The Dental Act of 1878 tried to bring order. But for years, anyone with a sign and a set of forceps could call themselves a dentist. Some even called themselves dental artists, which is exactly as reassuring as it sounds. Still, standards were rising. By the end of the century, dentistry was a bona fide profession. Children could aspire to become dentists, not just victims. Middle-class families could schedule cleanings, not just extractions. The day would come when fillings, cleanings, and orthodontics replaced the clatter and chaos of the barber's chair. The professional dentist was a symbol of Victorian progress. Educated, optimistic, and stubbornly determined to wrestle British mouths into order. So next time you settle into a modern dental chair and see a diploma on the wall, remember your Victorian ancestors. They walked so you could run and floss. The rise of the professional dentist didn't just save teeth. It gave the world a reason to smile again. Not even royalty could escape the tyranny of Victorian dentistry. If you think a crown protects you from toothaches, Queen Victoria herself is here to set the record straight, along with the shape of her jaw. After more than one unfortunate visit to the palace dentist. Yes, even Her Majesty, Empress of India, mistress of a quarter of the globe, found herself at the mercy of 19th century dental science. It was one of the few areas where being royal didn't come with perks, unless you count being able to scream in several languages. Queen Victoria's reign was famous for its strictness, prudery, and commitment to decorum. So when Her Majesty was stricken by toothache, the entire court became a little less stiff and a lot more anxious. Her personal dentist, Sir Edwin Saunders, was a man with nerves of steel and, presumably, very good life insurance. He was summoned to Buckingham Palace with all the solemnity of a state occasion and possibly an armed escort. The palace dentist's toolkit was the finest money could buy. Gold-handled forceps, gleaming drills, and elegant ivory scrapers. There was even a velvet-lined anesthetic inhaler for those brave enough to try chloroform. But the reality was as grim as any city back-alley surgery. An extraction was an extraction. Even if the waiting room was a gilded salon and the footman offered you tea with 6 sugars because it wasn't their teeth on the line. Victoria's dental woes were hardly a secret. She was known to suffer from recurring abscesses and, on several occasions, required extractions, each event meticulously recorded in her diaries. "My mouth most terribly swollen," she wrote after one particularly traumatic procedure, and the pain beyond words. "I felt quite desperate." One can only imagine the terror in the eyes of every palace servant when those words were spoken aloud. Naturally, the press caught wind of royal dental dramas. Newspapers reported on the Queen's toothaches, as if they were matters of national security. Whenever Victoria's schedule went suspiciously quiet, rumours swirled. Was she ill? Was there a diplomatic crisis? Or was she simply in bed, jaw wrapped in silk, glaring daggers at anyone who dared mention the word bonbon? Yet, Victoria was nothing if not resilient. She endured her dental crises with characteristic British stoicism. Even as she privately raged at her dentists, She insisted on setting a public example. No fainting, no wailing, only the briefest hint of royal displeasure. Once, following an extraction, she attended a state dinner with half her face numb and only managed to mutter, through dessert. History does not record whether she attempted the custard. What did come out of Victoria's dental misadventures was a strange form of progress. If the Queen herself needed professional dental care, surely the rest of the nation could aspire to the same. Her patronage of Sir Edwin Saunders lent dignity and respect to the rising dental profession. Suddenly, going to the dentist wasn't just for the desperate or deranged. It was positively regal. So the next time you nervously await a checkup, remember, you are not alone. Even the most powerful woman in the world once lay back in a chair, clenched her fists, and prayed for mercy as a man with suspiciously large forceps approached. Royalty or not, nobody is safe from a toothache. But thanks to Queen Victoria's bravery, and perhaps a little royal swearing, a nation learned to grit its teeth and bear it, one extraction at a time. Every generation has its technological revolution. The Victorians got steam engines, telegraphs, and, for better or worse, the dental drill. If you've ever sat in a dentist's chair and gripped the armrests as a gentle, high-pitched whirring filled your ears, congratulations. You owe your trauma to the bold inventors of the 19th century, who thought, what if we could make tooth pain faster? The first dental drills were not the compact, electric gadgets of today, but ponderous contraptions powered by foot pedals, springs, or, if you were very lucky, a small child willing to turn a crank. In 1864, British dentist George F. Green unveiled the clockwork dental drill, a device that promised to revolutionize cavity treatment. It was ingenious, it was cutting edge, and it was terrifying. The drill was big, noisy, and about as subtle as a Victorian locomotive. Imagine the scene. You're seated, upright and tense, in the best chair the dentist can offer. Beside you, the new drill gleams with brass and wood and ominous potential. There's a complicated system of belts, pulleys, and foot pedals, the sort of thing that would look right at home in a textile mill or a steampunk fantasy. Your dentist, proud and nervous, explains how he's about to bore out your decay with unprecedented efficiency. You wish he'd stop using the word bore. When the procedure begins, the room fills with a mechanical rattle. The dentist's foot pumps the pedal, the gears grind, and the drill bit whirs to life with all the grace of a wasp trapped in a coal scuttle. If the patient was lucky, the drill spun fast enough to reduce the pain to a fleeting scream. If not, well, it just dragged the agony out over several memorable minutes. The early drill bits were made of steel, prone to blunting and generating heat. Patients reported a burning sensation, the smell of scorched tooth, and a sort of out-of-body experience that comes only when you realize you are being operated on by a man using a machine that looks like it escaped from the factory floor. Occasionally, a drill bit snapped and shot across the room. An early version of dental Russian roulette. Dentists loved the innovation. Suddenly, they could clean out cavities and shape fillings with speed, precision, and just a touch of reckless abandon. For the first time, it was possible to save teeth rather than simply yank them out. But the price of progress was steep. Nerves were frayed, both literal and metaphorical. The sight of the drill was enough to make strong men faint and children plot elaborate escape routes. Victorians, never ones to miss a business opportunity, began advertising the dental drill as the future of oral health. Posters depicted serene patients calmly submitting to the new rapid relief, while in reality, most people left the chair pale, sweaty, and newly suspicious of all things mechanical. Still, word spread. Dental schools adopted the technology, and ambitious inventors set about refining it, making it smaller, faster, and, eventually electrically powered. By the end of the 19th century, the hand-cranked terror of the dental world had become the symbol of modern dentistry. It paved the way for fillings, crowns, and all the procedures that today's patients approach with a blend of dread and gratitude. So next time you hear that familiar whir, remember, it started with a foot pedal, a pile of gears, and a Victorian dentist's dream. The invention of the dental drill was a mixed blessing. More smiles saved, more nerves frayed, and a proud tradition of chair gripping that continues to this day. By the late 1800s, Victorian dentistry was clawing its way toward legitimacy. But nothing spread the gospel of gleaming smiles quite like a little public spectacle. If you thought getting your wisdom teeth pulled was traumatic, imagine it happening on a stage, in front of an audience, sometimes accompanied by music, cheers, and the occasional fainting spell. Welcome to the world of the traveling dental show. The concept was brilliantly bizarre. Enterprising dentists, eager for new clients and fame, loaded up their forceps, drills, and bottles of tooth tincture and hit the road. They set up shop at county fairs, bustling markets, and busy street corners, announcing their arrival with banners promising painless extractions and marvels of modern science. Some shows even included a live brass band, because what better soundtrack for a molar removal than a lively polka? Curious crowds flocked to the spectacle. Children elbowed for a better view. Local dignitaries were invited on stage to say a few words and possibly have their own dental work done at a discount for the sake of demonstration. At the center of it all was the showman dentist, dressed in a spotless coat, waxing poetic about the miracles of chloroform and the modern dental drill. For a shilling or two, anyone could volunteer to be the next lucky patient, or, depending on how you looked at it, the day's main event. The procedure itself was nothing short of theatre. The patient climbed onto a rickety chair, while the dentist displayed the tools of the trade, gleaming under the afternoon sunday. The audience watched every move, some with morbid fascination, others with morbid horror. The extraction began, often with a prayer, a gulp of gin, or both. If the dentist managed to yank the tooth in one smooth motion, the crowd erupted in applause. If not, well, the crowd still erupted, just with a few more screams and averted eyes. Of course, not every show went off without a hitch. There were mishaps, patients who fainted mid-extraction, teeth that flew dramatically into the orchestra pit, and audience members who lost their lunch at the sight of a particularly stubborn root. Dentists developed the patter of seasoned carnival barkers. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Mrs. Finch. She's just lost her first molar and gained a shilling. If all else failed, the band struck up another tune to cover the screams. In between extractions, the dentist hawked miracle cures, tooth powders, soothing syrups, and breath elixirs with ingredients best left unexamined. Bottles flew off the table, promising not just dental health, but courage, luck, and allegedly marital bliss. The bravest souls took home a souvenir, sometimes a pulled tooth in a tiny box, a gruesome reminder that modern science had, at last, reached their mouths. But beyond the spectacle, these shows served a purpose. They introduced new techniques, educated the public, and, most importantly, removed the stigma around dental care. No longer was dentistry a shameful backroom ordeal. It was entertainment, progress, and a badge of bravery. If you could face the dentist on stage, you could face anything. By the turn of the century, the traveling dental show faded away, replaced by clinics, regulation, and a more private sense of dignity. But for a time, dentistry went public, and the humble tooth extraction became an unlikely star. Next time you sit in a quiet, sterile waiting room, remember, your great-great-grandparents once cheered, gasped, and maybe even danced for a good old-fashioned public extraction. And that, perhaps, is why they all had stories worth smiling about. When you picture dental care, you probably don't imagine a crowded Victorian pub, thick with tobacco smoke, laughter, and the clang of tankards. But for much of the working class, this was the emergency room, the dentist's office, and the therapy couch, all rolled into one. Welcome to the era when a toothache could be solved with a pint of ale, a brave friend, and the sort of optimism only found at the bottom of a mug. Dentistry was expensive, and professional dentists, even the self-taught, certificate on a napkin variety, were out of reach for many. Barber surgeons charged a fee, and the new dental parlors were strictly for those with coin to spare. For everyone else, there was the local pub, the community's one-stop shop for courage, distraction, and a little dental drama. Picture it, a long wooden table, sticky with decades of spilled beer and questionable decisions. A man clutches his jaw in agony, surrounded by well-meaning friends. The bartender, a seasoned veteran of everything from marital disputes to impromptu wrestling matches, glances over and raises an eyebrow. "Tooth bothering you, is it?" A knowing nod. The barkeep reaches under the counter and produces an old pair of pliers, the kind usually reserved for stubborn corks or repairs to the door. Tonight, they have a more personal job to do. Step 1. Anesthetic. Not ether or chloroform, but gin, whiskey, or the pub's own house blend. The patient downs 2 or 3 shots, grimaces, and signals he's ready. Sometimes a friend holds him steady, sometimes several do, just in case the patient has a change of heart. The crowd draws closer, the storytelling pauses, and someone starts humming a funeral march, just for effect. Step 2. The extraction. The barkeep positions the pliers, squints at the offending tooth, and mutters words of encouragement. There are no surgical gloves, just rolled-up sleeves and a willingness to get the job done. With a quick twist and a heartfelt apology, the tooth is yanked free. Sometimes it comes easily. Sometimes it comes with a sound not unlike stepping on a snail in heavy boots. The patient howls, the crowd winces, and the barkeep drops the tooth into a mug for safekeeping. Step 3. Celebration. The victim is handed another drink on the house. The pliers are wiped off on someone's apron, and the pub erupts in cheers. Someone may even start a collection for the patient. A few coins for bravery, or perhaps just to help pay for the next inevitable visit. The extracted tooth is passed around as proof of courage, or, if the evening is slow, dropped into the fireplace with a flourish. This was dental care, Victorian style, fast, affordable, and public. The process wasn't sanitary, and the risk of infection was high. But in a world without antibiotics, you took what you could get. For some, the memory of pain-free moments bought with booze and bravado was enough to keep them coming back. For others, the missing tooth became a badge of honor, a reminder that they'd faced down agony with nothing but a crowd of friends and the cheapest gin in town. So, next time you fret about your dental deductible or grumble about waiting rooms, spare a thought for the poor man's dentist. In the pubs of Victorian England, dental problems were solved with grit, pliers, and a round of drinks, leaving everyone a little lighter, a little braver, and, quite often, a tooth or two short of a full smile. If you think today's kids have it rough with orthodontists and the annual No Cavity Club photo, spare a moment for Victorian children. In an age when childhood meant chimney sweeping, cold porridge, and the ever-present risk of being startled by a goat, dental care was just another lesson in survival. For the smallest Victorians, a loose tooth was less an exciting milestone and more a looming threat, a reminder that pain comes for us all, even before your 10th birthday. The first challenge was food. Children's teeth faced a daily assault of bread hard enough to qualify as a building material, turnips boiled into glue, and the new scourge of cheap, sticky sweets. Sugar wasn't just a treat, it was a rapidly spreading epidemic, and the little ones loved it almost as much as it loved destroying their enamel. It's no wonder Victorian portraits show children with tight, closed-mouth smiles. Those weren't shy grins, they were acts of self-preservation. But the real horror began when a child's tooth wobbled. There were no colourful plastic boxes or tooth fairies in sight. The extraction toolkit usually involved household items and grim determination. A mother might tie a length of string around the offending tooth and attach the other end to a doorknob, then wait for a sibling, or fate, to slam the door. A father with a flair for drama might go for the quick yank with pliers method, or, for truly loose teeth, invite the family dog to give the string a tug during playtime. The process was a family affair, with plenty of unsolicited advice and an audience of siblings eager for entertainment. If the operation succeeded, everyone applauded. If not, well, there was always tomorrow, and possibly another tooth to try again. For children whose nerves, or parents, failed them, the barber surgeon was the next stop. These professionals didn't believe in gentle bedside manner. Open wide, they'd command. And with a grip honed by years of multitasking between haircuts and amputations, the tooth was gone, sometimes along with a little dignity, and the will to ever eat an apple again. And what about pain relief? Forget topical gels and numbing sprays. The best-case scenario was a dab of whiskey on the gums or a hearty distraction, singing, storytelling, or if all else failed, the promise of a sweet bun for bravery. If you were lucky, the only side effect was a lifelong suspicion of doorknobs. If you were unlucky, well, at least you learned early that life was not for the faint of heart or jaw. Superstition also loomed large in Victorian childhoods. Some parents believed that burying a lost tooth in the garden would ensure the new one grew straight. Others tossed teeth into the fire, hoping to keep witches at bay. There was even a notion that swallowing your own baby tooth would grant you strength, though more often it just led to a brief parental panic and an awkward story at bath time. Despite the misery, Victorian children grew up sturdy, or at least, as sturdy as a person with half a set of molars could be. They learned resilience, creativity, and how to keep a secret, especially if it involved the fate of a missing tooth. So next time a child wails over a wobbly incisor, spare a thought for their ancestors who faced dental destiny with string, pliers, and a song. Childhood has never been easy. But in Victorian England, it was truly tooth and nail. It's easy to assume that, in the Victorian era, wealth solved everything. After all, the upper crust had silk sheets, warm baths, and servants who called them sir even before coffee. But when it came to dentistry, money didn't buy comfort, it just bought options. For the elite, dental care was a spectacle of glittering promise and gory reality, where the treatment was as likely to dazzle as it was to traumatize. Let's begin in the marble foyer of an exclusive dental salon. Here, you wouldn't find any barbers with rusty pliers. Instead, a gentleman dentist awaited, clad in frock coat and cravat, ready to guide you through a personalized tour of oral agony. There were gas lamps and Turkish carpets, and perhaps even a piano in the waiting room to soothe frayed nerves. Some offices employed a footman whose only job was to mop up nervous sweat and reassure you that everything was quite the fashion. The instruments gleamed with promise and a little menace, gold-handled forceps, jewel-inlaid mirrors, and the latest in European dental drills all promised a pain-free, luxurious experience. Some of these tools, it must be said, looked more suited to a royal jeweler than a medical man. But prestige was everything. To the rich, a well-appointed mouth was as essential as a well-tailored waistcoat. It was proof of breeding, restraint, and access to the best science money could buy. The treatments themselves were as bold as any Victorian adventure. Fillings were made of gold, soft enough to pack into a cavity, but precious enough to flash at dinner parties. Silver amalgam was also available, but gold was the true status symbol. The procedure was neither quick nor painless. Drilling out decay with the foot-powered engine was a test of courage, patience, and trust in anesthesia that may or may not have been adequately mixed. The scent of burning tooth was often masked by cologne, and nervous patients could request a sip of imported brandy, though most still left white-knuckled and wishing they'd chosen false teeth instead. For those with truly disastrous teeth and money to spare, there were full sets of custom dentures carved from ivory, mother of pearl, or actual human teeth, polished and set in gold frames. Fashion magazines ran breathless ads for the royal smile, promising you could eat, sing, and even whistle with confidence. The truth was a little less grand. Many a duchess excused herself mid-banquet to adjust her teeth, while gentlemen discreetly slid molars into waistcoat pockets when faced with a tough cutlet. Of course, privilege brought its own unique miseries. The rich consumed mountains of sugar, candied fruits, bonbons, chocolate creams, creating a perfect storm of rot and infection. The black-toothed smile became so common among the aristocracy that it was sometimes seen as a sign of wealth, a sort of perverse dental badge of honor. At least you had the money to fix or replace what sweet indulgence had destroyed. Despite the pain and pageantry, rich Victorians clung to the promise of dental perfection. Letters of recommendation were written for the best dentists, and a society dinner could turn into an impromptu showcase of who had the newest, shiniest fillings. Behind every gilded smile was a story of blood, nerves, and bravery, plus a bill large enough to make a duke blush. So next time you admire a golden filling or porcelain crown, remember, in Victorian England, the road to dental beauty was paved with gold and more than a little gore. The rich suffered for their smiles, and the world watched, one dazzling, occasionally wobbly grin at a time. Victorian England was a golden age for miracle cures and quick fixes, especially for anyone desperate to escape the misery of a toothache. If a pain persisted in your mouth, and you weren't ready to risk the barber's pliers or the dentist's foot-powered drill, there was always the allure of a bottle, something small, mysterious, and promising more relief than science could possibly justify. Enter the era of snake oil and mouth elixirs, medicine for the hopeful, the gullible, and the dangerously optimistic. Shop windows all over London displayed rows of colourful bottles with dazzling labels. Dr. Larkin's magical dental drops, Professor Fig's tooth elixir, instant relief. Mrs. Prendergast's soothing cordial for teeth and gums. The fonts alone could cure a headache, and the claims were even bolder. These potions promised to end tooth pain, whiten teeth, cure bleeding gums, and, if you read the fine print, possibly restore your social life, romantic prospects, and general sense of well-being. They were the Victorian answer to late-night infomercials, except you could buy them in every pharmacy, market, or from a man with a suitcase on the corner. What was actually in these mouth elixirs? The short answer: everything and anything. Popular recipes included clove oil, genuinely helpful for numbing pain, but the list often expanded to cover everything from menthol and camphor to turpentine and ammonia. Some elixirs were more like cocktails, equal parts alcohol, syrup, and whatever else the manufacturer could dissolve before the authorities caught on. And if you were really lucky or unlucky, your chosen tonic contained traces of cocaine, opium, or mercury. The result? A brief euphoric detachment from pain, followed by a strong urge to buy another bottle. The The advertisements were masterpieces of Victorian marketing. Engravings showed handsome men and elegant women with impossibly bright smiles, casually holding a bottle of Larkins, as if it were a glass of fine wine. Testimonials poured in. I was suffering terribly until one dose of Professor Fig's put me right. Sometimes the testimonials included a warning, do not exceed 3 spoonfuls, lest you see angels. No one seemed to mind. Word of mouth was powerful too. Mothers passed along recipes for home-brewed mouthwashes, steeped herbs, vinegar, brandy, salt, and a dash of wishful thinking. If you were feeling fancy, you could order imported tooth drops from Paris or Vienna, though those were just as likely to turn your gums blue or numb your tongue for a week. Friends swapped recommendations for which potions worked best, though worked usually meant tasted less awful than the last one. Of course, the medical community was skeptical, at least officially. Dentists issued stern warnings about unregulated concoctions, though even they sometimes dabbled in private label elixirs on the side. Guaranteed to soothe, they'd murmur, handing over a small bottle wrapped in brown paper, hoping the patient wouldn't ask too many questions. In the end, the popularity of snake oil and mouth elixirs was about hope. A hope that somewhere, in all those tinctures, was a shortcut past pain, a way to keep smiling without the terror of extraction. Sometimes, a mouthwash really did ease your suffering, if only for a moment. More often, it provided a story to share and a reason to avoid the dentist for another day. So the next time you swish with minty mouthwash or squeeze gel onto your toothbrush, remember, the Victorians would have traded a week's wages for such simple certainty. For them, relief came by the bottle, no matter what else came along for the ride. Long before, there was a sparkly, dollar-dispensing sprite to slip coins under pillows. Losing a tooth in Victorian England was a far stranger affair. The modern tooth fairy would have struggled to keep up with the elaborate, sometimes superstitious, and occasionally alarming customs surrounding baby teeth in the 19th century. For Victorian children and parents alike, the ritual of losing a tooth was less about reward and more about survival, both physical and spiritual. It started with a wobbly tooth, usually greeted by siblings with a mix of horror and glee. The prospect of extraction meant a homegrown ceremony, a bit of string, a slamming door, and a chorus of family encouragement or nervous laughter. Once the tooth was finally freed, accompanied by cheers, tears, or both, the real challenge began. What should you do with this tiny, suspiciously bloody souvenir? For Victorians, the answer mattered. Lose it carelessly, and you risked more than a gap-toothed smile. Folklore and superstition clung to baby teeth like barnacles. In many families, it was thought that witches could use a child's lost tooth to cast curses or summon misfortune. To avoid this dreadful fate, parents were advised to burn the tooth in the kitchen fire, bury it in the garden, or, if they were particularly cautious, hide it in a mouse hole. The reasoning was simple. If nobody could find your old tooth, nobody, especially not supernatural mischief makers, could use it against you. Some believed that tossing a tooth into the hearth ensured the next one would grow in straight and strong. Others held that feeding the tooth to an animal, ideally a chicken or mouse, would help a child grow new teeth as strong as a beast. You could also recite a little rhyme or chant a prayer to protect your child from toothaches, bad luck, or, more rarely, the urge to chew on inedible furniture. There were, of course, parents who opted for a more pragmatic approach. Teeth were stashed in snuff boxes, sewn into keepsake bags, or displayed in jars. Testaments to the family's resilience and the child's gradual march toward adulthood. While it's tempting to imagine rows of Victorian mantelpieces adorned with baby teeth, most families quietly disposed of them, fearing the consequences of lingering spirits or the embarrassment of losing one to a nosy neighbour. So, where does the tooth fairy fit in? The modern version, sparkles, coins, and pillows, didn't really exist. But by the end of the Victorian era, ideas were beginning to shift. Popular magazines and imported storybooks began to mention benevolent sprites and magical creatures who rewarded bravery and good hygiene. By the early 1900s, stories of the tooth fairy appeared in print, mingling with older superstitions and evolving family rituals. For Victorian children, the first glimmers of the fairy tale were just that: a rumour, a hope, a promise that losing a tooth might someday earn you more than a pat on the back. Of course, the reward of the era was usually a stern lecture about growing up, a bit of broth for dinner, or, if you were very lucky, a peppermint. Coins under the pillow would have to wait for future generations. But the seeds were planted. The notion that losing a tooth could bring a little luck, a little magic, and perhaps a brief moment of wonder in a world not always kind to the young. So, as you slip a coin under your own child's pillow, remember the Victorians. Their tooth fairy was more fire and folklore than glitter and gold, but even then, every lost tooth came with a story, and sometimes, that's the most magical thing of all. At the very end of the Victorian era, dentistry took a leap into the future, a future lit up, quite literally, by the discovery of X-rays. Suddenly, dentists had a way to peer beyond the gums, to see hidden decay, impacted teeth, and all the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. It sounded miraculous. It was also, in true Victorian fashion, more than a little terrifying. The story began in the 1890s, when German physicist Wilhelm Röntgen announced his discovery of a mysterious new kind of ray that could pass through flesh and show the bones beneath. Within months, enterprising dentists in England and America were snapping up crude X-ray machines, eager to experiment on their most trusting or most unlucky patients. In the era of "if it's new, it must be good," the X-ray was advertised as a miracle of science, safe, painless, and sure to revolutionize dentistry. What they didn't mention was the fine print. Nobody really understood how X-rays worked, let alone how much exposure was safe. Early dental X-rays required patients to sit absolutely still for several minutes while their heads were clamped into place with leather straps and iron braces. The machine itself looked like a cross between a stovepipe and a medieval torture device, with thick glass tubes and humming wires. As the dentist lined everything up, he'd calmly ask his patient not to blink, twitch, or think about all the times he'd spilled mercury in the back room. When the moment came, there was a faint crackle, a strange blue glow, and the odd sensation that you were being cooked from the inside out. Nobody wore protective gear. Not the patient, not the dentist, not even the curious onlookers who gathered to watch the spectacle. Why would they? Lead aprons were decades away, and radiation was still thought of as a kind of healthy tonic. Like fresh air or a brisk walk along the Thames, patients marveled at the strange ghost pictures of their jaws, blurred white teeth hovering in dark shadows. It was like peering into the next world. Some dentists framed these first X-rays and hung them in their offices as proof of modernity. A few, never one to miss a business opportunity, advertised bone readings along with their dental cleanings, assuring customers that any unusual glow was perfectly normal. Unfortunately, the Victorian enthusiasm for innovation far outpaced the understanding of side effects. Patients sometimes left the dentist's chair with a sunburned face, hair that fell out in mysterious clumps, or ulcers that took months to heal. Early dental journals quietly reported on peculiar skin complaints among dental staff, though nobody dared blame the magic machine. The phrase "it builds character" was never more true than for those who glowed slightly in the dark. Still, the X-ray was here to stay. It became a badge of cutting-edge care, and soon no respectable dental office would be caught without one. Victorian dentists may not have known the dangers, but they believed in progress. And nothing said progress like a patient who could see inside their own skull, even if it meant losing a few eyebrows in the process. So next time your dentist shields you with a heavy apron and flees behind a lead wall, remember, the Victorians lit the way with their bare hands, and sometimes their bare heads. The early X-ray was an adventure in optimism and oversight, equal parts miracle and regret. And if your teeth ever feel like they're glowing after a checkup, take comfort. You're part of a grand, slightly radioactive tradition. By the dawn of the 20th century, the age of Victorian dentistry was grinding to a close, and with it, centuries of horror, hope, and sometimes hilarity were making way for something new. Out of the chaos and courage of the 1800s emerged a single, unmistakable symbol of progress: the modern smile. It wasn't just about white teeth or pain-free appointments. It was about the changing relationship between people and their mouths, a small revolution, one tooth at a time. It didn't happen overnight. For much of the Victorian era, a smile was something to hide, or at best, reveal only with strategic caution. Teeth were a battleground, and a grin often exposed more about your diet, class, or luck than you'd care to admit. Yet, as dentistry advanced, so did the confidence to show your teeth to the world. Anesthesia became routine. Sterilization standards improved. Toothbrushes and toothpaste went from luxury to household staple. Smiling was no longer just the privilege of the rich and the brave. It was becoming, slowly, everyone's business. It was a cultural shift as much as a medical one. Photographs, once solemn affairs, began to capture rare flashes of teeth, especially from the young, the daring, and those showing off new dental work. Postcards featured happy couples, children with gap-toothed grins, and athletes flashing shiny winning smiles. Even advertisements got in on the act. Toothpaste brands urged Victorians to smile with confidence, and early film stars, those glamorous icons of the silent era, wore radiant, healthy teeth like a badge of honor. The shift was more than cosmetic. Better dental care meant fewer extractions, less pain, and longer-lasting teeth. For the first time, children could expect to keep most of their molars into adulthood, and adults could eat, sing, and laugh without planning emergency visits to the barber surgeon. It's no exaggeration to say that the ability to smile without fear changed the way people lived, and even how they saw themselves. After centuries of keeping their lips sealed, people finally had something to smile about. Behind the scenes, dental science kept marching on. The new century brought safer anesthetics, sharper drills, and eventually, fluoride. Dentists embraced X-rays, professional standards, and a dazzling new array of tools, now cleaned between patients. What luxury! Toothbrush advertisements promised gleaming smiles for all. And with growing awareness of hygiene, public health campaigns taught entire populations the importance of brushing twice a day. For once, pain and embarrassment were no longer inevitable. But the greatest change was social. The modern smile democratic, no longer the exclusive property of the wealthy, or the consequence of a dude, battlefield grave robbing. Dentures improved, false teeth lost their shame, and ordinary people could, at last, see their own reflection and think, not bad. Grinning became a form of connection, a way to signal warmth, humor, and trust. The simple act of smiling, long fraught with anxiety, was now an everyday pleasure. So tonight, as you brush your teeth under bright electric lights and check your smile in the mirror, remember, you're the inheritor of centuries of dental struggle. invention, and stubborn hope. The modern smile changed the century, not with a single dazzling grin, but with millions of ordinary, joyful, unashamed ones. And if you catch yourself smiling in your sleep, you can thank the Victorians, who suffered so you could show your teeth with pride. Waking up in Victorian England with a toothache was like discovering your day had been cursed before it even started. Pain relief was a hope, not an expectation, and the line between folk-ready and outright madness was razor-thin. Still, hope springs eternal, especially when your molar feels like it's been possessed by an angry spirit. Victorians, faced with the relentless throbbing of a bad tooth, reached for whatever was at hand, and sometimes for things that never should have been in a mouth in the first place. The go-to solution was the kitchen cabinet. Cloves were a favorite, pressed between aching gums. Their oil produced a numbing effect, albeit one with a flavor somewhere between holiday ham and firewood. Saltwater rinses were also popular. Swirl, spit, and pray for mercy. Some swore by a mouthful of strong vinegar, which stung so fiercely it briefly made you forget the original pain. For a particularly Victorian twist, you might dab whiskey or brandy onto the tooth, or simply skip the dabbing and drink until the ache faded into the background of your general existential discomfort. But when the kitchen failed, people turned to more creative measures. Onions, roasted or raw, were packed between cheek and gum in the belief that they would draw out the humours. A slice of cold potato, applied like a compress, was said to cool the nerves. For those with a flair for the dramatic, burning a bit of shoe leather and inhaling the smoke was thought to drive away the toothache demon. This didn't help the pain, but it did guarantee you'd have the kitchen to yourself for the rest of the night. The local apothecary was a treasure trove of questionable hope. There were tooth tinctures and drops in every colour and strength, promising instant relief and sometimes a small hallucination. Ingredients lists were more suggestion than science. Opium, laudanum, camphor, belladonna, or mysterious botanical extracts. Some drops worked by numbing the pain. Others worked by numbing the entire patient. The truly unlucky sampled the mercury-based concoctions, discovering a quick end to their toothache and, occasionally, their lunch. Superstition flourished in the face of misery. Folk healers promised relief through ritual. One charm required you to walk backward around your house at midnight, spitting salt over your left shoulder and muttering the Lord's Prayer. Another cure suggested placing a frog in your mouth, the logic being that the amphibian would absorb the pain. The only thing absorbed was the frog's overwhelming sense of betrayal. There were cures involving horsehair, blessed bread, and even, no kidding, the wearing of a dead man's tooth on a string around your neck. Perhaps the most desperate remedy was pure denial. Many simply gritted their teeth, literally, hoping the pain would vanish with time, prayer, or enough distraction. There was always a neighbor, a grandmother, or a kindly stranger in the market with a new suggestion, a half-remembered rhyme, or a bottle of something brownish and alarming. Some of these worked for a few minutes, most didn't. So next time you reach for your ibuprofen, take a moment to honor the creative misery of your ancestors. The Victorians suffered with cloves, onions, frog-based therapy, and the unshakable belief that there must be something, anything, that could defeat a toothache. If nothing else, they left behind a legacy. Hope, stubbornness, and a cautionary tale about what not to put in your mouth, no matter how desperate you get. In a world without Yelp, dental insurance, or even the faint promise of consistent hygiene, a special breed of Victorian hero, or perhaps anti-hero, emerged. The travelling tooth yanker. These intrepid souls wandered the highways and byways, part showman, part surgeon, and all bravado, offering the desperate a quick solution to the agony in their mouths. If the town's barber surgeon was booked, or, more likely, simply terrifying, and you didn't trust your neighbor's homemade forceps, you waited for the telltale wagon, a ramshackle cart, a weather-beaten banner, and the unmistakable scent of camphor at risk. The arrival of a tooth yanker was an event. Word spread fast. He's here. The tooth man. Within hours, a crowd would gather at the town square or market. The tooth yanker would set up shop, unfurling a stained sheet that doubled as both tent and operating table. His toolkit, a battered satchel full of gleaming, mismatched pliers, hooks, and ominously large forceps, was his badge of office. He dressed for the role, too, favoring a waistcoat splattered with mysterious stains and a top hat permanently dented by years of road dust and anxious hands. The show began with a speech, delivered in tones halfway between carnival barker and battlefield surgeon. Step right up. Suffer no longer. I guarantee relief, swift, scientific, and affordable. He'd wave testimonials, real or forged, and maybe display a collection of teeth in a jar, trophies from previous triumphs. Some tooth yankers travelled with a fiddler or drummer to keep nerves steady and drown out the inevitable screams. Choosing the first patient was part bravado, part volunteerism, and part peer pressure. Occasionally, a child was pushed forward by his siblings, but usually it was a red-faced farmer or an aging matron tired of her molar's mutiny. The chosen one took a seat, sometimes a proper chair, more often a barrel or crate, while the crowd leaned in, hungry for spectacle and hoping their own turn would somehow be less memorable. Anesthetic? Only if you counted the swig of gin provided for courage. The tooth yanker worked quickly, jamming his chosen instrument onto the offending tooth, muttering encouragement. Hold still, nearly done, and yanking with a sharp, practiced twist. If the tooth came out clean, the crowd cheered, and the yanker held it aloft like a trophy. If it broke, well, there was always the next appointment, or a hasty retreat if the mood soured. After each extraction, the patient was rewarded with applause, a free handkerchief, or, in rare cases, a coin. The tooth yanker would drop the tooth into his jar, wipe his tools on the corner of his coat, and invite the next brave soul forward. Sometimes, he'd toss a few drops of herbal tincture onto the wound and assure everyone it would heal by sunset. Infection and complications were tomorrow's problems. Despite the chaos, the travelling tooth yanker played a real role in Victorian communities. For many, he was the only option between endless pain and a chance at relief. His methods were crude, his credentials dubious, but his reputation was legendary. Even years later, families swapped stories. Remember the day the tooth man pulled Uncle Harry's molar right in front of the bakery? So next time you see a brightly lit dental office, remember the yanker's battered wagon and the courage it took just to sit down. For all their faults, these wandering miracle workers yanked more than teeth. They yanked a little hope from the jaws of despair and gave every town a story to chew on. If you think modern dental anxiety is bad, consider this. Victorians didn't just fear toothache. They feared mysterious, often catastrophic mouth diseases, a parade of ailments with names as alarming as their symptoms. The dental profession was still new, science was half guesswork, and every swollen gum was seen as a potential omen. In a century famous for fog and melodrama, the inside of a Victorian mouth was its own grim mystery novel. Let's start with feta oris, or, more bluntly, breath so foul it could send a dog whimpering from the room. Victorians blamed it on everything from spicy food to liver gloom. The real culprit? Rampant gum disease, rotting teeth, and the occasional decaying fragment of yesterday's dinner. If your breath could peel wallpaper, your diagnosis was miasma of the mouth. Treatments included mouth rinses with vinegar, chewing cloves, or for the wealthy, imported French tooth powder, which worked about as well as waving a scented handkerchief at a burning building. Then there was scurvy gums, not just for pirates, but for anyone with a diet low on fresh fruit and high on salted meat. Gums would swell, bleed, and recede with a persistence that alarmed even the hardiest souls. Loose teeth were common, and it wasn't unusual for an unlucky biter to leave half a molar in their bread. The remedy? Lemons, if you could get them, or failing that, a little prayer, and a great deal of resignation. Black tongue was another horror, sending sufferers scrambling for explanations. Doctors blamed noxious airs, melancholy, or reading novels by candlelight. In truth, it could result from medicine, poor hygiene, or, sometimes, the use of certain popular mouthwashes with heavy metals. Still, nothing sold more miracle elixirs than the promise to keep your tongue a healthy pink and not the colour of old licorice. But the true king of Victorian mouth maladies was tooth rot, blamed on melancholic humours, damp weather, and, increasingly, the devil's favourite food, sugar. Cavities were known as carious lesions, and their treatment was a roulette of home remedies, dubious ointments, and, when desperation hit, the forceps. Some doctors recommended rinsing with urine. Not recommended, even by Victorian standards, while others swore by rubbing teeth with crushed chalk or powdered sage. If you were truly unlucky, you might receive a mercury-based ointment and the blessing of your local apothecary. The medical establishment did its best to categorize, name, and treat the onslaught. Thick volumes on oral afflictions appeared in pharmacies, filled with nightmarish illustrations and stern warnings about the dangers of unchecked dental decline. Yet for all their charts and remedies, Victorian doctors knew less than they cared to admit. Diagnosing a mouth disease was equal parts science, superstition, and improvisational theatre. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it left the patient with fewer teeth, more anxiety, and a prescription for quiet walks in the country. Victorian mouth diseases weren't just a physical hazard, they were social disasters. A swollen jaw or missing teeth could mean lost work, missed marriage prospects, or becoming the object of village gossip. The only thing worse than the pain was the shame. So next time you feel a twinge in your gum, be grateful for antiseptic, science, and the utter lack of urine-based mouthwashes. The Victorians lived in a world where every tooth was a potential mystery, every diagnosis a shot in the dark. And yet, through bad breath, black tongues, and dental melodrama, they carried on, armed with pluck, powders, and an unbreakable, if occasionally crumbling, smile. In Victorian England, social class decided nearly everything: where you lived, what you wore, how you spoke, and especially how you faced your dental nightmares. If teeth were the great equalizer, everyone had them, at least to start with. Dentistry was the great divider, drawing bright lines between silk and soot, privilege and poverty. The way you lost your molars, and what you did about it, told the world exactly who you were. Let's begin at the top. For the rich, dentistry was just another avenue for displaying wealth and status. The finest dental parlours glowed with gaslight and offered imported French tooth powder, gold fillings, and dazzling false teeth carved from ivory or real human Waterloo teeth. Appointments could be scheduled at leisure, often accompanied by soothing piano music and a comforting glass of sherry. The dentist might even make a house call, bringing along a velvet-lined case of instruments, starched linens, and enough aesthetic to make anyone's memory of the ordeal pleasantly fuzzy. Their tools were elegant, their fillings precious, and their dentures, well, as convincing as 19th century craftsmanship allowed. Etiquette books instructed wealthy ladies in the art of smiling with restraint, lest anyone see that all that glitters might, in fact, be gold-plated. The pursuit of dental beauty was fashionable expensive, and sometimes deadly. But descend a few rungs, and the world changed. For the middle classes, dental care was an aspiration, a symbol of progress and respectability, but not always within reach. They might visit a trained dentist for a special occasion, a wedding, a portrait, or a desperate molar. But most relied on do-it-yourself kits, home remedies, or the barber surgeon's increasingly crowded chair. Tooth powders were mixed at home from chalk and charcoal, and whitening meant rubbing your gums with salt or lemon juice and praying for the best. The working poor faced dental disaster as a fact of life. No regular checkups, no gleaming offices, just the local pub, a friend with steady hands, or the travelling tooth yanker's visit to town. Infections were common, pain relief was rare, and losing teeth was an annual event, mourned but expected. A missing front tooth might mark you as tough, but too many gaps spelled trouble. Trouble at work, trouble in marriage, trouble with soup. Children from wealthier families learned to brush, eventually, sometimes even with their own brush, while their less fortunate peers were lucky if someone told them not to eat all the sugar in one go. For the very poor, teeth were sometimes sold, one by one, to pay a bill or buy bread. Losing a tooth wasn't just a medical event, it was a family's survival strategy. Yet even with this grim divide, there were moments of strange camaraderie. The pain of a rotting tooth didn't care if you wore silk or rags. Everyone, at some point, faced the agony, the swelling, the hope that maybe, just maybe, the next remedy would work. In crowded city streets and country lanes alike, you could tell the rich from the poor by their smiles, and sometimes by the way they kept their mouths politely shut. By the close of the Victorian era, dentistry was becoming more professional and, slowly, more accessible. Public health campaigns began to reach beyond the manor house. Toothbrushes, powders, and the dream of keeping your own teeth crept their way down the social ladder. Progress, though slow, was real. So tonight, as you brush your teeth in peace, remember, for the Victorians, dentistry was more than medical. It was destiny, divided by birth, fortune, and the whims of sugar. But no matter their class, they all learned one lesson. Pain, like laughter, needs no translation. And a lost tooth is a story everyone understands. By the twilight of the Victorian era, dentistry wasn't just a grim necessity or a battlefield for desperate improvisation. It was fast becoming an industry, an art form, and even, for the first time in history, a business opportunity. Where there is misery, there will always be someone ready to sell hope. And thus, from the soot and sugar, the birth of the smile industry arrived. Equal parts, science, spectacle, and strategic marketing. The transformation started innocently enough. As dental care improved, people began to believe that a healthy, attractive smile was not just possible, but desirable. Newspapers and magazines published etiquette columns praising good teeth as the hallmark of self-discipline and moral virtue. Suddenly, it wasn't enough to be clean, upright, and punctual. You also needed to flash a respectable smile, preferably one that wouldn't frighten the neighbors or set off the family dog. Advertisers leaped on a trend with gusto. Posters and pamphlets urged the public to try the latest tooth powders for whiter, brighter smiles. Mouthwashes freshens breath, secures friendships, and miracle toothbrushes made from imported bristles. The dream was clear. Anyone, rich or poor, could purchase a shot at dental respectability. Just follow the instructions. Don't ask too many questions about the ingredients. And remember, if it stings, it's probably working. Soon, the marketplace was flooded with smile solutions. There were powders guaranteed to erase stains, elixirs to fortify the gums, and even imported Parisian tooth cosmetics for those who wanted their smile to look continental. Competing brands boasted endorsements from doctors, real or imagined, and illustrations featured families so radiant you could almost forget their previous generations had survived on boiled potatoes and watery gin. The smile industry didn't stop at products. Services emerged too. Tooth, whitening sessions, breath consultations, and for the truly ambitious, entire books of smile exercises. The middle class, keen to keep up, flocked to dental lectures and exhibitions, eager to learn how best to maintain their facial assets. Dentists, once pitied and avoided, rebranded themselves as smile specialists. A new professional class was born, not just tooth pullers, but guardians of the public grin. Of course, the fashion for smiles brought its own anxieties. Etiquette guides warned against excessive display, lest one be accused of immodesty, or, worse, American enthusiasm. Satirical cartoons poked fun at society's new obsession, showing men and women smiling so broadly their hats fell off and their friends fainted from shock. Behind the laughter, though, was real pressure. To keep up appearances, to prove you were modern, healthy, and properly invested in your own set of chompers. Even those who couldn't afford the latest powders felt the impact. Children were scolded for neglecting the teeth. Factory girls swapped recipes for homemade breath fresheners. The dream of a winning smile, once the luxury of royalty, now belonged to the masses, at least in theory. And in parlors across the nation, awkward family portraits began to feature the hesitant, hopeful beginnings of a modern grin. By the turn of the 20th century, the smile industry was unstoppable. It would shape not just commerce, but culture, fueling everything from Hollywood glamour to the orthodontic empires of today. Victorians had lived through the worst of dental history, but in the end, they found something to celebrate. Not just survival, but the confidence to show their teeth, however imperfect, to the world. So as you fall asleep tonight, remember, the business of smiling began in an era of pain, but ended in hope. And with every bright grin since, we keep that legacy alive. So tonight, as you lie in bed, safe and snug, maybe run your tongue across your teeth and thank modernity for every last fluoride-coated miracle. Because once upon a time, the simple act of flossing could have been replaced by, well, screaming. Think about it. You live in an age where a dental checkup comes with anesthesia, sterile gloves, and gentle background music. Not a screaming contest with a man holding pliers in one hand and a pint in the other. You can walk into a clinic without seeing blood on the walls or hearing someone faint in the waiting chair. You can get a cavity filled